Thomas Reynolds, 72, had spent decades living a quiet life in Harborside. Most mornings, he could be found on the water before dawn, his weathered hands guiding the wooden boat he'd lovingly built after returning from service in a coastal town that was increasingly overtaken by luxury and tourism. A living relic, Thomas was respected by some, but invisible to most. His boat, Liberty Child, wasn't much to look at. The paint had long since faded under 40 years of salt and sun, and the wooden hull creaked with age. Yet it was sturdy, built by a man who understood that beauty often lay beneath the surface. Thomas had crafted the boat plank by plank after returning from Vietnam, using the rhythmic work to quiet the memories that still haunted him. The locals knew little about his military service. He wasn't one to speak of such things. They only knew that he had been in the Navy and that he sometimes woke screaming in the night. The sounds would carry across the water on still evenings, whenever he slept aboard his boat. That Wednesday morning began like any other. Thomas had set out at 5 a.m., planning to check his crab pots and watch the sunrise from his favorite spot near the harbor mouth. He had just finished securing his mooring when he heard the deep throb of powerful engines. The La Vida came around the harbor bend like a gleaming white mountain. 600 tons of Italian design and luxury cutting through the water with entitled confidence. At the helm stood Jackson Reed, a 38-year-old tech entrepreneur who had recently purchased the town's largest beachfront property. Thomas recognized him from the local papers, which had celebrated his arrival as an economic blessing for the struggling community. Thomas waved his arms to signal his position, but the yacht showed no signs of slowing. "Hey, I'm moored here," he called, his voice swallowed by the yacht's engine noise. On the upper deck, Reed and his guests raised champagne flutes, laughing at some private joke, oblivious or indifferent to the small wooden boat in their path. The harbor security boat bobbed nearby, its officer watching with apprehension, but making no move to intervene. The impact came with a sickening crunch. Liberty Child's stern splintered under the yacht's bow, though it stood no chance against steel and fiberglass. Thomas barely managed to jump clear, landing hard on the dock as his boat, his creation, his sanctuary, was torn apart beneath the larger vessel. The American flag he had flown every day for 40 years tore free and fell into the churning water, its red stripes bleeding into foam. Finally, the yacht's engines cut, and the sudden silence hung heavy in the air. Reed's annoyed voice carried clearly across the water. "It's just an old fishing tub, get over it." Thomas stood slowly, his arthritic knees protesting, and around him, a crowd had gathered, morning joggers, dock workers, tourists with phones raised. Not a single person stepped forward to help. The harbor security officer approached reluctantly. "Mr. Reynolds, I'll need to file a report," he said. But Thomas wasn't listening. He had spotted his flag drifting away, torn and sodden, limping along the dock. He reached down with an aching shoulder and pulled it from the water. He held the dripping fabric against his chest, cradling it as tenderly as he might have held a fallen comrade. His eyes, when he raised them to the crowd, held neither anger nor accusation, only a quiet dignity that made the onlookers glance away in discomfort. "Nice boat," Reed called from his deck, the sarcasm cutting through the morning air. "Maybe it's time to upgrade, old-timer. Everything has its expiration date." Thomas said nothing. He simply gathered the soaked flag and turned away, leaving the wreckage of Liberty Child behind, his back straight and his resolve unshaken. Despite the pain in his joints and the trembling in his hands, Thomas Reynolds' steps remained steady. His back stayed straight, the weight of the day heavy, but manageable. Behind him, someone laughed, and a phone notification pinged, announcing the first video had gone online with the caption, "Old man, old boat, old news." By noon, the harbor had returned to normal. The broken remnants of Liberty Child were cleared away, an eyesore removed, a problem solved. People scrolled past the video, most pausing only long enough to type LOL before continuing with their day. No one mentioned the tears that had glistened unshed in the eyes of the old sailor. Thomas's home, perched on a small bluff overlooking the harbor, was a modest cottage he had purchased decades ago with his Navy pension. Back then, property values were still within reach for working people, before the town had transformed from a humble fishing community into a booming vacation destination. Through his front window, Thomas had watched the change unfold slowly, like the relentless tide, gradual but inevitable. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table, a wooden chest open before him. Inside lay the artifact of a life of service. Faded photographs of young men with serious eyes, commendation letters yellowed with age, and dog tags that had once hung against his heart through midnight watches and storm-tossed seas. At the bottom of the chest, carefully folded, was another American flag, crisp and pristine, presented to him upon his retirement from active duty. His grandson, Michael, who was visiting from college, stood in the doorway, watching him. "You're going to sue them, right, Grandpa? That guy destroyed your boat. He should pay." Thomas shook his head slowly, his fingers tracing the embroidered stars on the flag. "He didn't hit me," he said quietly. "He only hit something nobody ever cared about." Michael frowned, the injustice burning brighter in his young heart than it did in his grandfather's weathered one. "But you built that boat. It meant something to you." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "To me." Later, after Michael had gone to bed, Thomas opened his old logbook. For 40 years, he had recorded the weather, the state of the sea, the catch of the day. But tonight, he wrote simply, "First day without Liberty Child. No condolences offered, just the words, but I can still hear the water calling." He closed the book and turned on his small television. The local news was running a story about Reed's yacht, celebrating it as the largest private vessel to ever dock in Harborside Harbor. There was no mention of the morning's collision. Online, the video had gone viral. Most comments supported the yacht owner. That old boat was an eyesore anyway. These boomers need to know when to retire. Why not just get with the times and buy a modern boat? The harbor master had called that afternoon, his voice professionally neutral. Your vessel wasn't equipped with radar reflectors or proper navigation lights. It wasn't up to current standards. I'm afraid the insurance company won't cover the loss. Thomas had listened silently, then thanked the man before hanging up. He hadn't bothered to mention that his boat had been grandfathered under older regulations or that he had never missed a safety inspection in 40 years. What was the point? Liberty Child was gone. The sea had taken back what he had borrowed from it for a time. That was the nature of things. Still, as he stood on his porch that night, looking out over the harbor lights, the absence of his boat ached like a phantom limb. It wasn't just wood and canvas that he had lost. It was a quiet morning spent watching dolphins play in his wake, the peaceful evenings when the rocking of the boat had soothed his troubled dreams. It was the one place where the war couldn't follow him, where the rhythm of the ocean replaced the memories of gunfire and screams. From his vantage point, he could see La Vida lit up like a floating city, music and laughter drifting across the water. Life went on without pause. The rich and carefree celebrated their good fortune, while an old man mourned alone. Thomas didn't begrudge them their happiness. He had seen enough suffering to last many lifetimes. Thomas only wished they understood what had been lost. Not just a boat, but a connection to something greater, a way of being in a world that valued silence and solitude and respected the sea rather than attempting to conquer it. Under the moonlight, he unfolded his retired service flag and draped it over the porch railing, letting the ocean breeze caress the fabric once more. At dawn, Thomas rose out of habit, reaching for his boat keys before remembering the hollow feeling that had expanded in his chest. For the first time in 40 years, he had nowhere to go. When the morning star faded, he didn't ask for compensation. He didn't shout. But he deserved one thing, respect. If you believe honor can't be bought, type honor. The morning fog hung thick over Harborside, shrouding the entrance to the harbor in a pearly haze. Thomas sat on his porch, coffee cooling in his hands, watching the ghostly curtain that separated land from sea. Since losing Liberty Child, he had kept the same hours, but now there was nowhere to go. He was a sailor stranded on dry land. The first indication that something unusual was happening came when the harbor foghorn sounded. 3 long blasts that vibrated through the morning stillness. Thomas straightened, his old instincts recognizing the signal for large vessels entering the harbor. Through the mist, gray shapes emerged, massive and purposeful, cutting through the water with disciplined precision. 6 Navy ships in formation, their outlines sharpened as they approached. No announcements had preceded their arrival. No celebration had been planned. Most striking of all was the silence. No horns, no signals beyond the necessary navigational requirements. On each vessel, the American flag flew at half-mast, a gesture of mourning and respect. As word spread, the townspeople gathered along the waterfront. Shop owners flipped their signs to close and hurried to the docks. Children were released early from summer programs, their excited voices hushed by parents who sensed the solemnity of the moment, even if they didn't understand its cause. From his vantage point, Thomas watched in confusion. No naval exercises had been scheduled. No dignitaries were visiting. There was no reason for this display of military presence in the small tourist harbor. The lead vessel, a guided missile destroyer, docked with precision. On the deck stood Rear Admiral James Nelson, his dress whites immaculate, his face composed in formal lines. In his gloved hands, he held a perfectly folded American flag, the triangle of blue and stars displayed with ceremonial care. Thomas felt a strange tightening in his chest. He knew that fold well, having performed it himself many times over his years of service. It was a fold given to honor the fallen, to recognize sacrifice. Slowly, painfully aware of his stiff joints in his civilian clothes, Thomas made his way down to the harbor. The crowd parted for him, sensing something important in his deliberate progress toward the assembled naval officers. Admiral Nelson spotted him and stepped forward. His salute was crisp and formal. "Chief Petty Officer Reynolds," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent harbor. "Permission to come ashore and render honors?" Thomas returned the salute reflexively, the motion embedded in muscle memory despite decades of civilian life. "Permission granted, Admiral," he replied, his voice steadier than he had expected. The Admiral descended the gangway, followed by a formal color guard. The assembled sailors on all 6 vessels stood at attention, facing shore. 43 years ago, Nelson began, addressing the gathered crowd rather than Thomas directly. This man prevented a catastrophic failure aboard the USS Constellation when a cooling system ruptured. During a storm in the South China Sea, Chief Petty Officer Thomas Reynolds manually sealed a compartment, sustaining severe burns to 60% of his body. His actions prevented toxic gases from reaching the sleeping quarters where 128 sailors lay unaware of the danger. A murmur ran through the crowd, and many turned to look at Thomas, seeing for the first time the faint scars that trace his neck and disappear beneath his collar. Chief Reynolds never spoke of his actions. Admiral Nelson continued, his voice steady. He declined the Navy Cross, asking only that we take care of the boys who didn't make it home. He has lived among you for 40 years, asking nothing, expecting nothing. The Admiral's gaze swept across the harbor, resting briefly on the gleaming yacht where Reed and several others stood watching. Yesterday, his vessel Liberty Child was destroyed in this harbor. No assistance was offered. No respect was shown. The flag he served under was allowed to sink. A young sailor stepped forward, carrying a wooden plaque. He approached Thomas, bowed his head respectfully, and presented the plaque to him. Thomas looked down at the polished surface, where a brass plate from a decommissioned ship was engraved with the words, "For the man who kept the sea safe even after service." "The United States Navy does not forget its own," Admiral Nelson continued. "We have come to render honors to Chief Petty Officer Thomas Reynolds and to acknowledge that his service did not end when he removed his uniform." All around the harbor, sailors stood at attention, saluting. The color guard raised their flags, and in that moment, it wasn't just 6 ships that had arrived. It was a full weight of naval tradition and brotherhood. Someone in the crowd began live-streaming the ceremony, and within minutes, the footage spread across social media platforms. The hashtag #BoomerDown that had accompanied yesterday's video of the boat collision quickly gave way to hashtag Veteran Salute. Commenters who had mocked the old man just hours before now scrambled to delete their posts, replaced by messages of respect and shame. "I had no idea. Why did anyone tell us he was a hero? This is what real service looks like." Reed, watching from his yacht, had the grace to look uncomfortable. His guests had fallen silent. Champagne glasses set aside as the ceremony unfolded. After the formal presentation, Admiral Nelson spoke privately to Thomas. "We heard about what happened from your grandson. Michael contacted the Navy Alumni Association. Why didn't you call us yourself, Chief? Thomas shrugged slightly. Not your problem, sir. It was just a boat. No, Reynolds, the Admiral said, his voice firm. It was never just a boat, and you were never just a sailor. He looked out over the water, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Some debts can never be repaid. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, something unexpected happened. One by one, townspeople approached Thomas, many for the first time in years, and offered their hands, their thanks, and their apologies. The harbor master presented him with fishing permits for life. The owner of the local marina offered him a slip, free of charge, for whatever vessel he chose. Thomas accepted it all with the same quiet dignity he had shown when his boat was destroyed. But to those who looked closely, there was a new light in his eyes. It wasn't triumph but recognition. After decades of silence, he had been seen. 1 week later, a small dedication ceremony was held at Thomas's usual mooring spot. A simple stone marker now stood on the dock, bearing the words, Liberty Child, a boat that carried more than one life. The town council had approved the memorial unanimously, with several members tearfully acknowledging they had never known the true story of the quiet man who had lived among them for decades. The harbor had changed in subtle but significant ways. Where tourists had once passed Thomas without a glance, they now paused at the memorial, reading the plaque that briefly outlined his service record. Local fishermen, who had gradually been pushed to the margins by pleasure craft, found themselves sharing stories of the man who had lived among them, the man who had carried the weight of duty long after the uniform was gone. Thomas was greeted with new respect. Most surprising was the change in the children. Where they had once been kept away from the old fishermen as irrelevant relics of a bygone era, they now gathered at the docks after school, eager to hear stories and learn skills that no app could teach. On this particular afternoon, Thomas sat on a newly installed bench facing his old mooring spot, demonstrating knot tying techniques to a group of attentive children. His gnarled fingers moved with surprising dexterity, transforming simple rope into intricate patterns that secured vessels through countless storms. This one's called a bowline, he explained, his voice gentle. Been saving sailors since before Columbus. A young girl named Lily, about 7 years old, watched with serious concentration as he guided her hands through the motions. Are you angry at the man who broke your boat? She asked suddenly, with the direct curiosity only children can manage. Thomas paused, considering her question with the same care he had given to teaching her the knot. No, he said finally. If not for them, perhaps no one will remember that boat ever existed. The children absorbed this with solemn nods, understanding instinctively a wisdom that many adults had missed. Later that afternoon, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Jackson Reed stood awkwardly at the edge of the dock, designer sunglasses pushed up on his head, looking distinctly uncomfortable without his usual entourage. Mr. Reynolds, he began, then stopped, clearly struggling with unfamiliar territory. I came to apologize. My behavior was inexcusable. Thomas nodded but said nothing, waiting. Reed produced an envelope. I want to make this right, Reed said. There's a blank check in here. Whatever you think is fair compensation for your boat and for my conduct. Just name the amount. Thomas looked at the envelope, but made no move to take it. Money won't rebuild what was lost, he said quietly. Then tell me what will, Reed replied, and for the first time, genuine emotion broke through his practiced charm. I've been a complete ass, and now I'm all over the internet as the guy who destroyed a hero's boat. Just tell me how to fix this. Thomas considered the younger man for a long moment. There's a spot on the eastern pier, he said finally. It faces the sunrise. Put a bench there, a good solid one that will last. Have it carved with 3 words. Sit, remember, thank. Reed blinked, clearly expecting a more substantial request. That's it? Just a bench? Sometimes, Thomas said, looking out over the water, what people need most is a place to stop and remember what matters. 2 days later, a master woodworker from Seattle arrived to install a hand-carved teak bench at the precise spot Thomas had indicated. The 3 words were inlaid in bronze, designed to develop a patina with the sea air but never fade entirely. Reed himself came to help with the installation, working without complaint despite the blisters forming on his manicured hands. Word of Thomas's response to Reed's offer spread to the town and beyond. The story was picked up by national media. Veteran declines fortune, requests memorial bench instead. Commentators debated whether he'd been too forgiving or profoundly wise. Veterans groups cited his example when discussing the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Thomas himself avoided the renewed attention. He continued his quiet routine, now centered around teaching rather than fishing. Without Liberty Child, he could no longer provide fish for the community kitchen as he had for decades, but he found he could offer something equally valuable: time, patience, and the wisdom that comes from living close to the elements. A month after the incident, Admiral Nelson returned, this time without fanfare. He drove a civilian car and wore casual clothes. He found Thomas at his usual spot on the dock. "The Secretary of the Navy has a proposition for you," Nelson said after they'd exchanged greetings. "There's a youth maritime program they're looking to expand. Teaching seamanship, navigation, and environmental stewardship. They need instructors who understand both the sea and young people," Admiral Nelson said. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "I'm an old man, Admiral. Not much use to anyone these days." Nelson laughed. "Tell that to the kids who followed you around like ducklings when I pulled up. The position's yours if you want it. Part-time, flexible hours, decent stipend." Before Thomas could respond, a commotion at the harbor entrance caught their attention. A small wooden boat was being towed in, newly built but with distinctly traditional design. On its stern, fresh paint gleamed. Liberty's Child. The entire town seemed to have gathered on the docks. Michael stood at the helm, grinning widely. "Surprise, Grandpa," he called. We all pitched in. "The design is based on your old plans. I found them in your shed." The Boat Builders Association donated the materials, and veterans from 4 states came to help with the construction. Thomas stood speechless, his weathered face filled with emotion, as the vessel that so closely resembled his lost boat approached the dock. "It's not exactly the same," Michael admitted. "Securing the mooring lines. We added some modern safety features, and the navigation system is updated, but the soul is the same. Your hands may not have built it, but your heart designed it." As Thomas stepped aboard, his feet finding their balance on the gently rocking deck with the instinct of a lifetime at sea, he ran his hand along the polished wooden rail at the bow. A new American flag snapped crisply in the breeze. "For a man who kept faith," Michael said quietly, even when it seemed no one was watching. That evening, as the sunset painted the harbor in golden crimson, Thomas sat on Reed's bench and watched the fishing boats returning with their day's catch. A young couple paused nearby, reading the 3 words carved into wood. Their child asked what it meant. "It means," the father explained, "that we should stop sometimes and think about the people who made our lives possible." Thomas smiled slightly, his gaze on the horizon where the sea met the sky in a seamless union of blue. In a world racing ever forward, he had become a living reminder to look back, not with nostalgia, but with respect for the foundations upon which the present is built. His new vessel would sail the same waters as the old, carrying forward the same values: steadiness in storm, help freely given, and quiet courage when required. He didn't ask for justice. He just picked up the torn flag and walked away. But the next morning, the sea remembered him. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where honor isn't forgotten and silence never wins. It's just an old fishing tub. Get over it. The yacht owner laughed as the massive hole crushed the veteran's boat. No one helped. No one apologized. The American flag on the sun-bleached vessel drifted into the harbor, torn. But the next morning, the entire harbor turned silent as 6 Navy ships pulled in without a word, their flags lowered to half-mast. Who were they saluting, and why had the sea suddenly remembered one forgotten man? Still believe that good deeds come full circle? Share your thoughts.